Hello?
Hey, Bradley.
Okay, how are you?
All right. Can't complain too much. How about yourself?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good. It's good. So glad to see that, well, I know that Amanda will be out, and I don't know if, actually, Morgan's supposed to give a talk today, so we'll see when he gets here what it's about. It's actually about, it's collective behavior. I'm not really sure what the topic is.
Whoa. Huh. Is it live in somewhere out west, maybe, or can we watch it?
Oh, no, he's going to give it in the meeting here.
Oh, great. Perfect.
Yeah.
One fine misunderstanding. Shoot.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Jesse, I know you can't talk for 30 minutes or so, but that's okay. So, welcome to the meeting. So yeah, we're waiting on Morgan. I don't know if when he's gonna show up, but he's gonna give a talk. I know we met yesterday on the GSOC front, so I don't know if Brian, you want to give an update. You're the only person here who usually gives an update.
Yeah, sure. It would be pretty similar to the update that I gave yesterday, but there are some new interesting kind of things. So most interesting, I posted this in the GSOC channel, is that I've been really looking more deeply into active inference approach in terms of modeling the organization as a collective cognizing agent. And so I've been looking into a Python implementation of active inference called PyMDP that seems pretty interesting. I haven't really gotten too far with it so far because it's kind of working in this weird grid world kind of thing that I don't know how. I can't really. My brain so far isn't quite up to speed with how exactly it's going to apply in a much more complicated, layered, hierarchical kind of context like an open source development organization. But I'm hoping that the book and the Active Inference Lab's Discord, actually, I'm hoping that all that stuff kind of combined will help move things forward. But yeah, no, not much of an update there. Mostly that we're building a fence here at my house. That's the other exciting thing that's happening.
Okay. Well, that's good. Yeah. All right. Thanks for waiting. Welcome back. All right. So I'm going to get started here with our materials. So thanks for the update again. I'm going to check our Slack, and I'm going to go through some of our things in our Slack, and I'm going to talk about a couple of things that happened this week outside of the lab, and then we'll go through some other things, and we'll see how that goes. Let me share my screen here. All right, so first, you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So this is the Ethics, Society, and Tech channel, and I wanted to go over this because we haven't gone over it in a while. So I don't know where we last kind of stopped here or where last we hit on this, but we've had a lot of activity in here since late May. So, we have, let's start with this one here. Aaron put in something on criminalizing cyber flashing. This is where people get sent lewd images that they didn't ask for. It's one reading. Detection tool legislation. So that's her suggestion for what needs to be done there. By the way, it's a false equivalency to try to dismiss this legislation by saying a person online isn't in danger, since forced exposure, flashing, and real-life laws don't depend on viewer being in danger either. So this is sort of a legal gray area she's pointing out. Jesse put in a link from Eric Cole's blog on why watch other people play video games. This is about esports and sort of the nature of that that thing. Morgan posted on this meeting about a conversation on ethical neuroinnovation. So that's an area that, this is a Neurotech X event, so this is something he's involved in. He's involved in the Neurotech X organization, but, he's pointing out some of the things that they're doing with respect to, ethics. This is Cohere, OpenAI, and AI21 Labs have just announced a set of best practices for responsible deployment of large language models. So again, we get back to the large language model discussion, and this is a set of best practices for responsible deployment. The joint statement is a first step towards fostering an industry-wide conversation to bring alignment to the community. So this is the link here, and let's see if it opens up. Okay, so this is the best practices for deploying language models. This is Cohere, OpenAI, AI21 Labs have developed a set of best practices for any organization developing or deploying large language models. So if you go to some of the principles here, the first set are prohibit misuse. So there are two under this. Publish usage guidelines in terms of use of LLMs in a way that prohibits material harm to individuals, communities, and society, such as through spam, fraud, or astroturfing. Usage guidelines should also specify domains where LLM use requires extra scrutiny and prohibit high-risk use cases that are inappropriate, such as classifying people based on protected characteristics. So that's one way to prohibit misuse. Another way is to build systems and infrastructure to enforce usage guidelines. This may include rate limits, content filtering, application approval prior to production access, monitoring for anomalous activity, and other mitigations. So again, these are things that an organization can do when they implement a model like this. Another one is mitigate unintentional harm. So this includes proactively mitigating harmful model behavior. So we've talked about this, about sources of bias and training data, minimizing unsafe behavior such as learning through human feedback. So that's one way to mitigate harm. Another way is to document known weaknesses and vulnerabilities, such as bias or the ability to produce insecure code, as in some cases no degree of preventative action can completely eliminate the potential for unintended harm. And so documentation is always good in any situation with open source software or with implementing a model in your organization. And the documentation should include use case specificity. So this is where you go through and you think about the use cases that you'll be using it for and tell people what needs to happen to meet these standards. The next one is thoughtfully collaborating with stakeholders. So this is building teams with diverse backgrounds. So this is just making sure that people are at the table when these things are implemented, especially if they're implemented in, different communities in the world or in the country, and making sure that those people are at the table. Publicly disclose lessons learned regarding LLM safety and misuse. So knowing like the history of that and the world of possibilities, things that could happen. Treat all labor in the language model supply chain with respect. So this is where you have people on the other end of this model who are curating the data, the training data. They're doing other things that involve the language model, building the language model. And so providers should have high standards for the working conditions of those reviewing model outputs in-house and hold vendors to well-specified standards, and ensuring labelers are able to opt out of a given task. So this is an issue with like a lot of the social media content labeling, that people have often been overworked and sometimes traumatized with what they're seeing. And so this is something that we worry about because, we want to make sure that we're not abusing people when we're building these models. So, and of course, when you're implementing it in your organization, this is something that is important to adhere to as well. So that's from Cohere AI. That's a nice example, I think, of some ethical standards for different technologies. So this might be something that, we think more about in terms of open source ethics too, because these are issues that come up in open source all the time, especially with respect to like documentation and human relations and things like that. All right, so then Aaron posted another link on human rights in the metaverse. So as we know, the metaverse is the Meta or the Facebook vision for virtual reality, and this is about human rights. So people, when you become an avatar, sometimes you don't hold yourself accountable in terms of your behavior, but also people accessing different resources and other things like that. There are a lot of things that, this article kind of just discusses it, but there are also ethical standards I think one could come up with for this as well. This is from Morgan, the Ecosystem Challenges in AI. This is a virtual workshop that talks about some of these, or ecosystemic challenges in AI. So this is talks about a lot of the challenges in AI, in the ecosystem of AI, and I think it links back to this set of standards here. So that's a video if you want to watch that workshop, virtual workshop. That's where it is. I posted this article on open source is throwing AI policymakers for a loop. So this is something that I found really interesting, because this is something that open source is a nice thing when you want to develop things quickly, or you want to crowdsource things, or you want to get people involved in software development. You want to build customized tools and things like that. But when you're dealing with AI and some of these ethical standards and some of the, quite frankly, safety standards you need for a large model or even a moderate AI system, sometimes open source can be bad. And what I mean by that is that sometimes open source can undermine some of those goals. So open sourcing like a security procedure or a set of security standards can make them less, more vulnerable, and maybe less sort of under the control of a single entity, where they can review the output of what the code looks like and things like that. So there can be less accountability, and putting it in charge of, like, putting having it as an open source thing can often lead to, like, things not getting done. So I'm not saying that open source is always bad for these sorts of things, but they can be, and this is something we need to think about. And so this article, Throwing AI Policymakers for a Loop, this kind of goes through some of the challenges. And so they ask the question here, depending on whom you ask, artificial intelligence may someday rank with fire in the printing press as technology that shaped human history. So the jobs AI does today are nothing compared to what it might do in the future, but who is drawing the roadmap? So this is where you get, actually in this article they do talk about how open source platforms don't really jibe with some of the roadmaps that your, like, academic organizations and big tech companies are drawing out. So, people are kind of building open source solutions to things, but they don't, and they may be in the AI area, but they don't necessarily have the same type of roadmap that some of these other organizations are using. And so this is something that, there's a gap here between, and we've talked about this, and in fact, that was one of the impeti for our project, our open source ethics project, where you have this difference between what open source orgs are doing and what other orgs are doing in this space. So this is Morgan posted to this AI happy hour talk on key health findings, which I think are like the health of AI. That's from Stanford AIMI. This is AI and the everything in the whole world, whole wide world benchmark. So we've been talking about benchmarks recently, and this is a paper on these. I guess they're large like kind of large models of the world. So the whole wide world benchmark is this. This has Emily Bender on Alex Hanna. So there's a tendency across different subfields in AI to valorize a small collection of influential benchmarks. So this is, things like pole balancing and other types of technical benchmarks that you can get performance on. And that's good, but that doesn't really generalize to the real world or to the broader world. These benchmarks operate as a stand-in for a range of anointed common problems that are frequently framed as foundational milestones on the path towards flexible and generalizable AI systems. State-of-the-art performance on these benchmarks is widely understood as indicative of progress towards these long-term goals. In this position paper, we explore the limits of such benchmarks in order to reveal the construct validity issues, framing as the functionally general broad measures of progress they are set up to be. So this is something that, when you have benchmarks, oftentimes they're very restricted in what they tell you about the system. So, are they something that tell you about how it's going to perform under a wide range of conditions, or is it something that's very restrictive? And so they kind of talk, but what they mean by construct validity issues is that they treat these benchmarks as sort of social science measures or scientific measurements. And they look at like how valid they are with respect to things that you want the AI to do. So there's this idea of internal validity, external validity. In this case, it's a construct validity. Like, what are you measuring? What's it involve? What kinds of things are in that measurement? And then how valid are they to the kind of problems you want to solve? So if you're using something like pole balancing, that's a nice linear control problem. But then mapping that linear control to something else in the world is a difficult thing. And so, we consider benchmarks, and we kind of come up with these benchmarks, and they're very niche in terms of what they can tell us about performance. But they don't really have, a lot of times people don't consider sort of this meta-analysis of benchmarks and how effective they are. And then finally, I posted on the FAccT conference from this year. So this is the conference, FAccT. This is the one where, this is an AI ethics conference that people talk about all the time in this field. So this is, I actually have a couple of slides on this. Yeah, there we go. And so this is kind of a recap of this this thing that happened this week. So if I go over to this, this is the ACM FAccT 2022 program. This is what they've been talking about. So it was a 4-day conference from Tuesday to Friday. So there are a lot of different topics covered at this conference. There are all sorts of like ethical considerations, what could possibly go wrong, speculative practice towards anticipating the negative consequences of humanitarian AI, designing data and data science, about algorithmic auditing, algorithmic fairness. There are a lot of different topics. I'm trying to find something that's particularly interesting to this group. Here's one: research meet engineering, or research meet engineering, or how I stopped worrying about scaling and learned to love the process. So there's been a lot of talk about AI scaling and how if you just build bigger models, they're more intelligent or they solve your problems better. But this is like where they kind of step back from that and consider other things. And so, yeah, this is a nice, it's very long. I think this actually started as a workshop, if I'm not mistaken, a couple years ago, and they've expanded it out to like a 4-day conference. This is really a lot of stuff here. I don't know if I can put a link in the Slack, make sure people have access to it, but I didn't link to this in the Slack directly. So I found this and brought it up. So there's a lot of good stuff here. I would definitely go through some of it. I don't know how much of it is available as a, as something you can like read through as papers or whatever. But There's algorithmic governance in the public sphere. Other types of things. Yeah. So I actually have another set of things here. I think these are tweets, actually, from Abiba Burhani on her insights into FACT. So as FACT comes close to a conclusion, here's what I appreciated. Having attended most sessions, the community's openness to critique, which I think makes this community unique, and a beacon of light and a role model for other similar conferences. FACT is not perfect, and there remains plenty of room for improvement. However, its openness to critical work should be applauded. I appreciate the inclusion of a session dedicated to work that critiques the community itself, and hope this continues as it gets bigger. You can't have an inclusive, welcoming, and healthy community without first understanding and acknowledging existing problems. Creating a safe space to do exactly that is a crucial first step towards change and progress in the right direction. And then she goes on to talk about how there was actually a session critiquing FACT, so critiquing the notion of FACT, and it contained 3 papers, one of her own and 2 others. There's this paper, Counterfactual, How FACT's Acontextual Framing Undermines Its Organizing Principles. The second is The Forgotten Margins of AI Ethics. And the third is The AI Ethics Money Problem. It's at FACT. Which is, of course, this is the idea of, if you're doing your work at a corporation, you need to have it funded, and the funders don't necessarily want to answer the questions that are the most relevant. So there are a lot of ways in which that's a problem. These papers held back no punches in pointing out the limitations and problems with work that is praised and taken as foundational within the field of AI ethics. That's the first one. And this is how FACT undermines its organizing principles. And 2, the shallowness of most publications within the AI ethics space, especially in FACT and AIES. So this is the forgotten margins of AI ethics. And then this third figure here, and then there was a third paper involving the corporate invasion of AI ethics and the deep conflicts of interest that remain scrutinized. Confronting power and corporate capture at the FACT conference. So this is a paper as well. Not only did many people attend the session, but these papers were met with a great standing ovation, which is extremely encouraging. So a final word here, creating a safe space for critiques, both within and outside, is extremely important for a healthy community. In fact, is promising to be a good model. I hope FACT continues to make space for such work, and hope that other conferences follow this model. So, yeah, I think there's some really interesting insights in that conference and in that work. And I just wanted to give a tour of some of the things that we're doing with some of the discussions we're having with AI ethics and with ethics more generally.
Yeah, I love the FACT conference stuff I was seeing on Twitter. Lots of really, really helpful and interesting papers and articles and people doing good work. Thanks.
Yeah.
For going over. It's really exciting.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Some of the stuff we've been talking about, we haven't really gotten into too many issues like that in our work, but we've been talking about a lot of things in terms of sustainability, and we've been posting things in the channel here on that, and I think there's sort of an intersection between AI and open source. Some of them are kind of practical, like the thing I pointed out about the article about open source and how it tends to have different roadmaps for things like security and other things, but there are also ethics in terms of who gets access to open source. And what I mean by that is, nominally open source is open, but sometimes it's a matter of people having the education and the skills, or at least making that accessible to people. Sometimes open source is not really completely open. They're like conduits into the open source framework. So, if you're thinking about contributing to a project, how do you make it into the project? can you manipulate any part of the project, or are there certain areas that are accessible? So those are things that, they're all kind of, we don't think of them from an ethics standpoint usually. We think of them from like kind of, oh, well, we got to do something about that. Or, maybe we don't think about them at all. I don't know. But they're definitely things that I think are decent questions to ask. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting. If you look at the comments on that one article from IEEE, here I posted this, there's a whole thread on Hacker News of people kind of saying what their problems with that article on open source are, but most of it just sounds like, people saying things you could imagine.
Yeah.
Oh, this must be a submarine kind of sneak attack on the open source community. Like, this is ridiculous. It's like Wikipedia. There are gatekeepers that you don't really know unless you're involved in the community, and kind of both supporting what the article's saying in another angle, and then at the same time kind of being needlessly defensive a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
But I did think that they pointed out the problems, and there's a lot of problems, which I think is an interesting thing, with the EU GDPR legislation, and how they don't really understand open source or talk about it, and how they don't really seem to totally get what AI is and how to regulate it. And so we live in an exciting time.
Yeah. Yeah, we've talked about GDPR a little bit in the past. Like, it's almost like the U.S. does too little for, like, security and for, tech regulation, and the EU tends to do too much. It's kind of weird, but
yeah, exactly. They're overcompensating in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's good, and I hope that people check that out. I think we've not talked about ethics, tech, and society in a while, so I wanted to spend some time on that. Okay, Jesse, are you available yet? Wanted to check in with you.
Yeah, it's been a half hour. What's going on in Chicago? I wish I could come to the meetup. By the way, my parents live in southern Michigan, so
okay.
But I don't know if I'm going to make it. Because what day were you all going to meet up? Is that July?
Oh, it's tomorrow, actually.
It's tomorrow. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to.
Yeah, not being able to do it, but that's okay.
Yeah, it sounds fun.
Good. Okay. Let's see. Let me share my screen again, I guess. Let's see. Yeah. I might as well get into some of this other stuff that I have here. So what are the other things? Yeah, I'm going to get into some of the readings that I have. I have a lot of readings that we have backed up here. I want to go through some of them. And by the way, this Slack, we have other channels that have been, like, there's been a lot of activity in them. We have the Bradenburg Vehicles channel, which Morgan's putting a lot of things in with respect to some of the things that we've been talking about on training in virtual environments for agents and multitask curriculum learning, and some of these models here for, like, language models, and I guess they're like these two emergence articles, maybe three. I don't know what this is. Oh, this is a GitHub repository, but and I'll get to some of these in a little bit. These emergence papers. So there's emergence of hierarchical reference systems and multi-agent communication, emergence of theory of mind collaboration. So there's this whole collection of papers that came out on emergent phenomena in large language models and in multi-agent models. I'll go through some of that in a bit. So there's been a lot of activity in Bradenburg Vehicles on some of this stuff. There's also been, I think, some activity in the virtual reality and neurotech space. And so we've had some... I posted a paper on landmark finding and analyzing different landmarks using graph theoretic analysis. There have been some other things posted in here. on different topics. But I've actually been working on a Discord server for virtual reality and augmented reality and things like that. And it's called Principles of Bits to Matter to Mind. So let me see if I can open up the... Yeah, so this is the name of it, Principles of Bits to Matter to Mind. And I have like a handful of people in the... Yeah, I think Brian McCorkle's here. So that's good. And so what I'm thinking of doing here is setting up a series of channels where we can discuss these things in more detail. So I've been working on another project, and we've had a really robust discussion in the virtual reality channel. And this is, you know, on different demos for mobile AR and for other types of, you know, microelectronics and how to implement those in interfaces. There have been other discussions in this, and I've kind of bringing this from the past into the present, and I've archived some channels and I've started some new channels. So we have closed loop feedback. It's a new channel. Data sets. This is a data set on. This is the rich data set and the bistro method for inferring 3D contact on the body from a single image. So this is some, you know, these are things that I'm finding and I'm putting them in the channels. So I've got a Gibsonian information channel and a neurobotics channel and a general channel, of course. But this is something I want to build on. I want to be able to build on this, you know, these conversations we're having in the Slack. Because I think it'll structure them a bit more and it'll drive it forward maybe a bit. Now I think this is the thing that I was trying to get to here. So I said that there were a bunch of papers on emergence and on agent-based simulation. So I have a collection of papers here I'm going to go over, and they're kind of semi-related, but you know we'll talk about them maybe in context. So this is a first paper, Introduction to ABED, which is Agent-Based Simulation of Evolutionary Game Dynamics. And this has an economics flavor to it. It's from Games and Economic Behavior, which is this journal that is economics-oriented. So this article is on this free and open source software, ABED, and this is for simulating evolutionary game dynamics in finite populations. So this is something they do in economics to understand, you know, human groups and how they exchange things. And evolutionary game dynamics are where you have a number of players and they play these games and they try to reach these evolutionary equilibria. So they have, you know, you can have like a competition and it will evolve eventually to, you know, over a number of interactions, it will evolve to a stable state somewhere. So there will be a set of stable states that you can analyze and you can say things about that population and their interactions. If you go into some of the other games in game theory, they have what they call iterated games. And it's not quite the same as evolutionary games, but they have that same structure where there's a payoff structure over time. So you start from moment one and you go forward for a number of iterations, and the payoff structure evolves and the individual payoffs evolve. And you can actually plot out those functions in a graph. And so we explain how ABED can be used to simulate a wide range of dynamics considered in the literature and many novel dynamics. In doing so, we can introduce a general model of revisions for dynamic evolutionary models, one that decomposes strategy updates into selection of candidate strategies, payoff determination, and choices among candidates. Using examples, we explore ways in which simulations can complement theory in increasing our understanding of strategic interactions in finite populations. So this is a paper on, this kind of goes over the evolutionary game theory, or how these work. these kind of models. So you have, they actually go through some of these models and kind of some of the different methods that they use here. This is a review of methods, so they have a lot of references here. I'm trying to think if there are any figures in these papers. In this paper, this just shows you how this is set up in NetLogo. So this is actually a NetLogo simulation where it's actually something that's where they've made for the platform, and they're using it in the platform itself, not in the. Yesterday we talked about the Python implementation, but this is the GUI implementation. So they show you how to set up a payoff matrix and candidate selection and a switch and a slider for the number of n of trials. So these are all important parameters for this model. So they kind of go over what the software ABED, and it is NetLogo, but it isn't in the NetLogo GUI. It's in this ABED GUI, but basically it shows you how this works. So I'm trying to see if there are any more insightful figures in here, or tables. So yeah, this is a map of strategy distributions. This shows like a history of strategy distributions over from 0 to 1, which is, I think, the frequency of implementation, and then over time. So they have 1 to 10,000 seconds. So this is very much, something that happens over time. These are the marginal empirical distributions of different strategies. And then this is a map of joint empirical distributions. So this is a nice visualization, but it basically shows that there's these different strategies and they have different empirical joint distributions for different kinds of games. So this is a nice paper to go over if you're interested in evolutionary games. This is a paper, it's related, it's not exactly related, but this is another set of evolutionary strategies. This paper is Evolution Through Large Models. So this is Joel Lehman, Kenneth Stanley. These are people at OpenAI. Kenneth Stanley is involved in a lot of genetic algorithms and evolutionary algorithms. So he's done a lot of stuff with, some of the evolutionary algorithm and neuroevolution models. So this is sort of applying this methodology to large language models. So this isn't agent-based modeling anymore. This is large language modeling. So the abstract reads, this paper pursues the insight that large language models, or LLMs, trained to generate code can vastly improve the effectiveness of mutation operators applied to programs in genetic programming, which is different from genetic. Well, it's similar to genetic algorithms. There's a wider range of techniques, but they're using this mutation operator, which means that they introduce a mutation into the code at some frequency. And so you can tune these mutation operators, and the more mutations you have, the more variation you have. The less mutation, the more conservative it is, but it doesn't introduce any novelty. So because such LLMs benefit from training data that includes sequential changes, modifications, they can approximate likely changes that humans would make. To highlight the breadth of implications of such evolution through large models, with something they call ELM. This is different from LLM because you're doing this large language modeling, you're getting corpuses of words and you're putting them together through correlation. This is where you have evolution through large models, which is a different methodology. In the main experiment, ELM combined with map-elites, which is another technique, generates hundreds of thousands of functional examples of Python programs that output working ambulating robots in the Sodarace domain, which the original LLM has never seen in pre-training. So these Sodarace robots are interesting. They're these little skeletons that kind of have a physics of their own, and they can move around. You can set the parameters for the flexibility of the skeleton, and they move around, they dance around, And I assume they're going to be describing these robots and their movement, but I don't know. But this is basically something that can be generated, and then the original LLM has never seen these in pre-training, so the LLM, I guess, has to classify them. These examples then help to bootstrap training a new conditional language model that can output the right walker for a particular terrain. The ability to bootstrap new models that can output approximate artifacts for a given context in a domain where zero training data was previously available carries implications for open-endedness, deep learning, and reinforcement learning. These implications are explored here in depth in hopes of inspiring new directions of research now opened up by ELM, which are these evolution through large models. So if we get into the paper a little bit, we can see that they talk about genetic programming and how it works. So one of the things about genetic programming is you generate a bunch of programs, and you mutate them, and then you select the best programs. So you generate a bunch of programs. You can introduce this mutation operator. You can introduce something called a recombination operator. So you use the rules of evolution to shape these different programs and what they look like. So you're generating a bunch of diversity. Then you're selecting on that diversity. So you're saying we're going to select on the diversity and see, based on like maybe its fitness, which ones have the highest fitness. And so the ones with highest fitness get promoted to the next generation, and then you reproduce a bunch of these. You make different variants of it, and you select and you go forward. So this is an adaptive method that doesn't just try to find the best local solution per se. It's generating a bunch of variants, and it's selecting upon the fittest variants depending on your criterion. So say you have a criterion for what's making the best walker robot, which one is generating the best movement, however you define it, and then you select those programs that are generating the best movement. But to get there, you need to generate a bunch of variants and then select upon them. This is very different from, say, like a model where you train it with data and you're making associations and you're generating, you're trying to tune the parameters so that you generate just the right text. That's a bit different method from that. But so they talk about that here. A second obstacle is that nearly all GP methods explore through random perturbations of code. Unlike humans who through active practice improve their proficiency in making deliberate, complex, and coupled modifications to programs. Unlike perturbing, say, like neural network weights, wherein continuous parameters subject to small enough perturbations can predictably generate small changes in functionality, perturbing code requires discrete changes that often dramatically shift functionality, thereby complicating search. So, making these changes to the code, you have to make small changes. Sometimes if you make changes that are too big, you can dramatically shift the functionality. So it's a problem in terms of finding the right place in the search space. While there exist approaches towards more directed generation of offspring, which is, in this case, building probabilistic models of high-performing programs, evolving reproduction operators, or applying less impactful mutation operators, the problem remains at core unsolved. And so this is something that you see in GP methods. So in neural network weights, you're trying to tune the parameters. In GP methods, you're trying to make small perturbations, and you want to make small changes in functionality. But when you make a perturbation that's too big, you can really shift the functionality dramatically. Sometimes that's good, but sometimes that's bad. They say it complicates search because you might end up in a different part of the search space. You might end up nearby. So it's hard to say what the effect is. But so they kind of lay out the reasoning for using GPs and how it differs from neural networks, how it differs from human learning. Then they talk about large language models, and I want to get down to some of these other things. I wonder if they have any figures on some of these. Okay, so the Sodarace robots, that's what I wanted to get to, if I can find it. Okay. So this is actually the map of diverse champions. This is what they're doing there. They have these Sodaracers. They have the height and the width, and they're these, this size in pixels. And so you have a Python program that describes a Sodaracer, and then a Python program that's evaluated. So this is what they call map elites with ELM. So this is sort of the algorithm that they're using. And then, right here, so here's a Sodaracer. So this is a Sodaracer. This is where you have point masses and springs. So they're basically like these little skeletons. And you design them so that they have springs that link the point masses in different ways so that they can move against the ground. So, this Sodaracer would bounce around on each of these point masses. And the springs are these links between the point masses, and they're either very rigid or they're very flexible. And so if they're pliable, then they have more, they have less resistance, and so they can bend and sometimes they make, that makes for less than ideal movements. Sometimes the movements are uncontrollable. Sometimes they're tighter and more controlled. But really what's going on here is that you're evolving, you can modify these Sodaracers in different ways. You can modify it in terms of its size, its topology, but you can also modify it in terms of how strong these springs are. And so if the springs are, more pliable, maybe they don't bounce as much. Maybe they make, movements that are less controlled. Maybe they make movements that are more controlled, depending on the design of the Sodaracer. But these are little point mass robots that they're using in this paper. So this is the code. And then this is again, so this is a hand-designed square Sodaracer, just so you know what that looks like. And then they give their results here. And so then in stage 2, they're using language model training. So the product of stage 1 is a collection of programs, whereas stage 3 RL requires an initial model that can output valid Sodaracer generating programs. Thus, the second stage of the invention pipeline fine-tunes an LLM on the products of ELM, which serves as the initialization for an RL-based conditional inventor. To do so, first requires compiling the results of stage 1 into a fine-tuning data set. While there are still many ways to distill a data set of programs and runs of ELM, a simple threshold approach is adopted here. So they're using this ELM to generate these models and evaluate them. And so this is kind of an interesting set of results. I'm not really sure what they mean because I'm not going to get in that deeply into the paper. So this is a nice application of like large language models and these sort of evolutionary approaches. And so, showing what some of these large language models can do when they're not necessarily being trained on language, and you throw in these Sodaracers into the mix. So these are examples of the Sodaracer, the wheel Sodaracer, the galloper. So you have these seeds. You have a radial seed, a square seed, and a CPPN seed, which is, I guess, a randomized one generated by a network. And so these are runners, gallopers, and wheels. And so they have these different shapes, and they make these different types of movements, and they're optimized for these different types of movements. So a natural further question is how well the model will do when taken out of distribution. How well is it really internalize the dynamics of Sodarace? So that is training and test set for fine-tuning are taken from the same runs, and thus the model will likely have encountered all the motifs in the test set. So it may not be a representative test of how well the model will generalize in the future. So a preliminary test in this spirit is to take the first half of the Python programs, describing several inventions from unseen runs, and explore the capacity of different models to generate functional completions. So what they're doing here is they're trying to figure out how these models do with out-of-distribution Sodaracers, and basically how well is a generalized some of the sort of the principles of soda races and soda racers. So, if you have a soda racer it's never seen before, can it deal with that as well? And so that's what this is. And, I guess it's decent. I guess so this is maximum fitness percentage of original, and they show this. So the conclusion is that the 80% threshold models perform better than the 50% threshold, and there's no obvious trend in performance once model size reaches 85 million parameters. So scaling up doesn't necessarily help you. So I like this paper. It's it's very deep and it's a lot to take in, so I don't want to get too deeply into it. These are the other two papers, the Emergence papers. This is the Emergence of Hierarchical Reference Systems in Multi-Agent Communication, and this one is Emergence of Theory of Mind Collaboration in Multi-Agent Systems. So in the first paper we talked about economic games, and the second one we talked about using large language models for kind of other purposes for looking at these the design of agents and the classification of agents. And this third one is this third and fourth one are the emergence papers, I'll call them, which is where you have hierarchical reference systems in this paper. So in this paper, the abstract reads, in natural language, referencing objects at different levels of specificity is a fundamental pragmatic mechanism for efficient communication in context. We develop a novel communication game, the hierarchical reference game, to study the emergence of such reference systems in artificial agents. We consider a simplified world in which the concepts are abstractions over a set of primitive attributes, such as color, style, and shape. Depending on how many attributes are combined, concepts are more general, which is a circle, or more specific, a red dotted circle. So these are two different concepts that are more general or more specific. And so you're combining attributes to get to these concepts. Based on the context, the agents have to communicate at different levels of this hierarchy. Our results show that the agents learn to play the game successfully and can even generalize in novel concepts. To achieve the abstraction, they use implicit, omitting irrelevant information, and explicit, indicating that attributes are irrelevant strategies. So they use two different strategies here. They use this implicit strategy, which is they just basically optimize all the information, or they use these explicit strategies where they basically make attributes irrelevant. And so this is kind of an interesting way that this works in terms of in terms of learning to play the game. In addition, the compositional structure underlying the concept hierarchy is reflected in the emergent protocols, indicating that the need to develop hierarchical reference systems supports the emergence of compositionality. So this is really about compositionality. You have these hierarchies of description. They have to figure out how to play this game. Then they have to figure out how to put things together. And this is, of course, a way to approach compositionality in a way that, this is something that we worry about in language a lot. Learning language, compositionality, putting together different parts. We talk about it in developmental AI as well, but this is another approach to this problem. And so they talk about this in language emergent simulations. So these are not large language models, but these are different types of studies where you have a sender and a receiver agent, and they're trained on a reference game. So then they have to so the sender sends a target object and sends a message to the receiver. Using that message, the receiver tries to identify the target among a set of distractor objects. So they have to sort of identify things that are the language target versus other things. In its current form, reference games completely ignore the different contexts that may require referential expressions at different levels of abstraction. So they don't have any sort of reference to the environment or to anything. It's just you recognize something or not. Having no access to the distractors, the sender cannot choose relevant object attributes in a context-dependent way. So this is something that, is one problem with trying to put together language and meaning is, these kind of dynamics. and they kind of model these things. So this is an example of a concept hierarchy where you have like these shapes with different attributes. So you have a shape with a color and a style, and so it's, you know, it's say it's a square or a circle. You have, it can be filled in, it can be, you know, transparent, it can be just the edge, it can be a dotted line edge. You can have different colors or different shapes themselves, and so you put these together in different hierarchies. So you have, for example, you know, you have circle red filled. You can achieve that by having a red circle and then having filled at the end. So you're putting together this hierarchy in different ways. So it goes from concrete to abstract. So you're going from like maybe from a circle and then down to circle red and then down to circle red filled. So I was going the wrong way before. This is red filled, and then circle red filled. And there are different pathways to getting to this. This is an example. It's more sort of a letter example, but you have, you know, different. So you have, like, you start with AXX, you have ABX, and then you have ABC, or AXX, AXC, ABC. You know, the different pathways depends on how it's put together. So it's put together. You have to put these three characters together in different combinations. This is actually something you could approach with an evolutionary approach too. You could evolve different. You have all these different possibilities, and you create variants that represent these things, and then you evaluate them to see how fast they're able to put this together. So I mean, there are different ways you can approach this problem. So they developed this hierarchical reference game to sort of improve upon the state of the art in this area. And so instead of an object, the sender receives a concept as input. The concept is defined by an attribute vector, an object, and a relevance vector, context. And so then you have this, you solve this problem of context, at least in the context of this game. Well, the game is designed to encourage communication at different levels of abstraction. It does not regulate how this abstraction is realized. In particular, there is no explicit pressure on the emergent language to reflect the compositional input structure. So this is combining games and language and emergence. The second one is emergence of theory of mind collaboration in multi-agent systems. And so this is a theory of mind, which is where if I'm an agent and I see another agent, I'm trying to figure out what's in that other agent's mind. What are they thinking? What are their intentions? This is something they've looked at in other, non-human animals, and they've had mixed results in trying to figure out whether they're expressing if they have a theory of mind. We know that humans have a theory of mind, and that's hard enough, but then people have looked in other animals. Now we're trying to model theory of mind here, in a computational system. So this is going to be interesting. The abstract reads, currently in the study of multi-agent systems, the intentions of agents are usually ignored, meaning that the agents, we don't think about their intentions, we think about what their output, maybe their inputs, and what they're processing. We don't think about intentions so much. Nonetheless, as pointed out by theory of mind, people regularly reason about other mental states, including beliefs, goals, and intentions, to obtain performance advantage in competition, cooperation, or coalition. So, when we have these collective behavior systems, we often think about maybe how they're coordinating. We think about like they're observing a behavioral state. But we're not thinking about them making a judgment about the agent's intention separate from that output state. So this is an interesting way of thinking about this. However, due to its intrinsic recursion and intractable modeling of distribution over belief, integrating TOM in multi-agent planning and decision-making is still a challenge. In this paper, we incorporate TOM in multi-agent partially observable Markov decision processes, or POMDP, and propose an adaptive training algorithm to develop effective collaboration between agents with TOM. We evaluate our algorithms of 2 games, where our algorithm surpasses all previous decentralized execution algorithms without modeling TOM. So this is interesting. I'm not going to get into the results too much, but I know that Brian is interested in this area, and I know that Himanshu's not here, is interested in this area, so this may be something that they want to dig into a little bit. But again, they're looking at this emergence question, and they're using this theory of mind aspect of it to sort of gain some insights. And so we compared our adaptive TOM algorithm with several popular multi-agent benchmarks using various flavors of policy gradients and Q-learning, and achieved robust performance close to the state-of-the-art models, which are not only trained in a centralized way, but also have centralized modules like shared queued functions or meta-agents, which are these agents that control the whole collective. Moreover, we found that TOM can facilitate the emergence of more universal protocols decipherable across different groups. Our model beats all benchmarks with a large margin and flexible group assignment experiments. So this is an interesting paper. And I would say, hello, Samantha, how are you? I would say that this is, one of these papers that, how it relates to language and how it's kind of an interesting set of connections there. Attempts to integrate TOM and opponent modeling has profound cognitive science origins. Lola learns the best response. Yeah, Lola in 32, that's the reference. Learns the best response to evolving opponents. Yet opponents' partners' real-time beliefs are not considered into policy. Interactive POMDP, or IPOMDP, moves one more step forward by actually modeling opponents' mental states at the current moment and integrates others' beliefs into the agent's policy. So this is interesting. This is like where we have other agents out there, and they maybe have different beliefs than the target agent, the focus agent, and they're trying to infer, maybe based on previous behavior, what their intention is. Maybe they intend to move left, maybe they intend to move right. And so you use that to inform the policy. So this is all sort of feedback over time, and you have to sort of have the right answer in terms of what you think your neighbor's intention is in order for it to be useful. But it's an interesting approach. So that's all I'm going to say about those papers. I think that's a good overview of those things. I'll put the papers in the Slack in the general channel along with this recording. So Brian said like a random forest ML algorithm, and that was with
in response. I think it was the first paper that we went over. Kind of this idea that you generate a bunch of different possible models and then test them and then take the best one.
Yeah.
Which is also similar after we went deeper into the papers to the genetic algorithm, which is now I feel like I finally understand genetic algorithms a little better.
Okay.
Which is great.
Yeah. So genetic algorithms are really interesting, especially with respect to some of these other approaches, like in neural network approaches. And people have actually gone ahead and combined the two, where they take, they'll generate a bunch of neural networks as, in a population. And then they'll have different, they may introduce this mutation operator or recombination operator. And then they'll take those and they'll evaluate them in terms of their fitness. So one of the things you find in genetic algorithms is this fitness operator. And you don't necessarily have this in neural networks themselves. You usually tune the parameters. You say, okay, there's some loss here. How can I minimize the loss? And you just keep moving the dials, and that's it. In genetic algorithms, you don't move the dials so much. You say, I'm going to make a fitness criterion, and I'm going to say, this is what I want. And this gets a little tricky because you can reinforce what you want, or you can kind of discover new things. Like if I said I want to have a model of the Incredible Hulk, right, from a square, and people have done this with faces where they've taken a bunch of polygons and they introduce mutations to the sort of the space of polygons, and it kind of looks like a face, and then it gets down to a face, and you can evolve interesting faces that way, just iteratively, just kind of making this fitness judgment over and over. But one of the things about fitness functions is that you can define it sort of a priori and say, this is what I want, which gives you sort of the answer you want, but it isn't really like, it isn't necessarily the way evolution works. This is just kind of like bootstrapping to a solution that you want. And so you may be throwing out some interesting things without realizing it by doing this. Now, it's what you want to do if you want like you have an intended goal and you want to get to something. But, outside of that use case, I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to think about this. But yeah, there are a lot of ways you can define fitness functions. But you have these operators. You usually have mutation, which is where you take, maybe if you have a neural network, it could be like pruning the network in different ways, taking out nodes, adding in nodes, adding in an input that's, different. Or you could recombine the network or recombine the input in different ways. And so those are the things you can do to modify. And then you have this population of possibilities. So you've introduced these things and they recombine or mutate in different ways. And that gives you a bunch of variation to work with. Some people say it's a lot slower, say, than like a neural network. But the difference is that you get this sort of landscape of things that you can select from. So it's generating more stuff that's interesting and then selecting on it. So it's slower, but it's like there's some advantages that have yet to be really championed. In that second paper, though, I think it was really interesting. I wasn't particularly clear on why you would need to use large language models there. I think the point was to show kind of you can use them in different ways and you can integrate them, maybe contrasting with what people are doing with large language models. But yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of comparison too, because you have these models that are, we kind of think that, well, they're generative and they make these, they can make these interesting things, but, genetic programming kind of gives a different perspective on that. And so, and in the Sodarace stuff, that's something I've been fascinated by for years. We've had, I worked with in graduate school, some of these Sodaracers. You can build your own Sodaracers, and they're very simple sort of virtual robots. So, you can get all of these different weird phenotypes that some of them fail, some of them are really interesting. And, that's like the essence of like something you could do with a genetic algorithm, is generate these things. Because they're very simple and they have like, they have a relatively small number of parameters relative to like, say, a actual robot. But they do some really interesting things. So.
And what about the last paper, I think it was, the one, Emergence of Theory of Mind collaboration? I found that paper really fascinating, but I'm about to start digging through the bibliography a little bit, but is there an algorithm for theory of mind, or is there like some way of determining when theory of mind has emerged? I never thought it would be quantified in that way. It's really interesting.
Yeah, so I guess, theory of mind, if we back up and think about what that is, it's this idea that I am an agent, or I'm an animal, human, and I look at, like I'm looking at you, and I want to know what your intentions are. You have kind of a cryptic expression on your face, say, or you have your camera off, and I want to know what you're thinking. So I kind of make up scenarios in my head about, like, what is it that you're thinking, and then how should I respond? And so, like, they've done this with, like I said, with non-human animals, and they've tried to prove that they have theory of mind, and it's supposed to be, like, this hallmark of, like, intelligence, or this hallmark of, like, consciousness, maybe. But it's really hard to prove. But one of the things you can do in these models is you can create sort of, representation, or you can have like some representation of intentionality. So like thinking about it really simply in terms of these agent-based models. And I'm going to go to my board actually, because this might work better. So, oh yeah, let me share my screen. It would help. So we have agents that are in, say, a flock or maybe some collective behavior that they're engaging in. Okay. So you have this individual and you have these people, these agents around it. And this agent is going to be emitting behaviors, and all the other agents are going to be emitting behaviors. Let's just assume it's a movement behavior in different directions, right? So we know from like the Boyd's example, that's the classic example of bird flocking in a computer system, that the individuals move in different directions. And you have to predict what your neighbor is going to do. So, you kind of have these rules that set out that say, if my neighbor is moving in a certain direction, I want to move in the same direction, but I don't want to get too close, I don't want to get too far away. And then through that, that's the emergence of behavior. So this collective, the behavior is going to emerge out of this that's coherent. So you're going to have these coherent flocks, birds or fish, schools of fish that kind of have these shapes. So, the shapes like this. And in this new Bradenburg Vehicles paper that's coming out by our group that we've been working on for several years, we talk a little bit about like characterizing shapes of collectives like this. So there are different shapes that emerge from collective behavior. You can use agents to generate these structures, and they have different shapes. Sometimes you see things like milling, which is like milling around a central core, or you see things like shapes like this, where it's like a kidney, where it's like there's a comma, where you have a head and a tail. All these things are metastructures. And one of the things that you get, the way you get metastructure, is you get these agents interacting and predicting how each other are going to move, and they use these rules to do this. But another way forward, instead of the rules, is to assume, okay, I have a set of behaviors that are autonomous to me, right? I have a suite of possibilities that I can run through. I can say, I can move forward, I can move backwards. I don't want to get too close, I don't want to get too far. Maybe I want to, exhibit some innovation. But then I have a model or a representation of what my neighbors are doing. And so now I want to not just predict what they're doing with respect to the next step, but I want to know what their intention is. This is a little bit different than like prediction, because prediction is where I evaluate maybe a set of probabilities or a set of scenarios. And so that's like, a set of probabilities which have like, no, I don't know if we use numbers attached to them, but we use likelihoods. We say, this is likely, this is less likely. And so you have this distribution, this informal distribution that you draw from. Now, with theory of mind, you're actually trying to figure out the intent or the mental state of your neighbor. And so this is a little harder, because that means that you have to figure out kind of what their set of strategies that they're picking. So I talked about evolutionary game theory in the first paper. So in evolutionary game theory, you usually have a strategy suite. And that's like this set of strategies that you pick from, right? And they all have sort of a different likelihood of selection. If your neighbor does something, then you do something back. And, this is like the basis for games like Tit for Tat, or like, the Prisoner's Dilemma, where you have to predict, what your opponent or your partner is going to do and do the optimal likewise strategy. So in Prisoner's Dilemma, you and your partner are separated in terms of information. You have to decide to say, rat out your partner, or defect and say that you're, or you have to decide to coordinate each other, don't rat each other out, or one of you defects and rats the other out, and then you both lose. So there are different ways that this plays out. In that case, in Prisoner's Dilemma, you actually have a sort of a theory of mind. They don't call it theory of mind. But it's basically dependent on that, on having a model of which your partner is doing. In this case, it's a cooperative game where you have, basically you have to coordinate your behavior or not coordinate your behavior. And if you don't coordinate your behavior, you lose. And if you coordinate your behavior, you win. But it's dicey because you don't know what your opponent is doing. There's what they call private information, which means that you don't have access to it. Your opponent is the same in the same situation. There's private information at play that they can't access. And so the reason I bring these points up, in this game theory perspective, is because that's exactly what theory of mind is. You're basically trying to coordinate with your neighbor, and because it's something that is in their mind, you can't access it. They generate these states, but there's a latency there. So if they generate a state moving in this direction, you can follow suit. But you don't know exactly what they're going to do at any one time, so there's a latency in their behavior. If you can coordinate, if you can simulate their mind properly and know what the next state is going to be, then you can respond in unison. You can both move in the same direction, knowing that you're always going to be correct. But things like movement even have private information. It's generated by some process that another agent doesn't know anything about. So there's always this latency, there's always this sort of discoordination in these kind of flocks. And you see this in some of the patterns that are generated. Sometimes the patterns are pretty tight, sometimes they're not, and it's hard to classify them in different ways and identify them. So, this is, for collective behavior, this is important for something like flocking, but also for something where you're dealing with decision-making, like the prisoner's dilemma, and these models of the mind where you have your own set of strategies, and you have to sort of generate a set of strategies for other individuals. You're assuming that they have the same set, they're operating on the same set of strategies, but they may not be. But nevertheless, you have to come up with this sort of model of mind of what the other agents are thinking. And then if you can predict that properly, then you can benefit from that. But it's... there are a lot of moving parts to that. I know that may have been a little bit...
no, that was good.
Yeah, okay.
Because that was, it really, intention really seemed like the kind of difference between, for example, something like active inference or a decentralized POMDIP, which I think I'm going to start calling it POMDIP.
Yeah.
That when you include the intention, and not only the intention, but like kind of a model within a model. So if each agent has a generalized, not generalized, but if each agent has a model of the world outside of itself, and then that model includes other agents, it's like inside of that model of the world, then inside of that model of that individual agent, then you have all the beliefs and intentions and characteristics of that agent's mind that you think might be there, and then throwing it into play and seeing if it works. That's really helpful. So that's reading back over the paper a bit more too. This is a really interesting paper. There's a lot of cool looking math in here.
Yeah.
To dig into that.
Being an economics paper, it does have a lot of math, but that's...
Yeah. Yeah. Theory of mind collaboration.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm gonna this is great.
All right. Yeah. I thought that would be, kind of an interesting way to look at those papers. I know that people so there are two different approaches to emergence. And one of the things about emergence is it's very hard, like people throw the word around, and I know there are a lot of debates on what it actually means. But there's, and then there was another paper, and I didn't pull it up, but it was on emergence and large language models. So I don't know why I didn't put that in the list, but, and it maybe in the Slack, I don't know. But it's about like how these things that emerge in the large language model space. So last week we talked about large language models and meaning and how you can generate data sets that will, create a semantic scale, and you can do things with interesting things with large language models that way. This one I think was like what emerges from a large language model. And we saw with the Sodarace paper that you can use them for things like Sodarace generation, and there are different properties there. But this is where what is happening with large language models. There's emergence going on there. How do we understand that? And so, emergence is a really interesting topic. People have approached it by looking at things like, collective behaviors of social insects like ants, looking at like ant colonies. One of the interesting things they found is that, these structures, these emergent structures, will be generated by some forward process. And that forward process isn't necessarily reproducible. So you have these agents that interact, and they do these things, and they build these structures, and they look really, maybe people will call them well-designed or, optimal, but really they're just like emergent structures that emerge from these interactions. And if you were to go across different ant colonies, for example, you'd see that they have different structures, but they're similar. They're different but similar. So they're almost like self-similar, like a fractal. You have like just variations on a theme. So, ant colonies always look a certain way. They have this quality, like they're, they have like branching, and they have like pathways and chambers, but they're maybe in different places, or they're maybe slightly different shapes. So, but you can recognize as the human classifier that that's an ant colony. It's unmistakable. And so it's interesting how you get these structures that vary, but they're very similar. But then what's interesting about emergent structures from that perspective is you can't really reverse engineer how it's built. So you can't go back through step by step and say, this is how it was built. It's hard to do a reductionist analysis of it. So that's one of the things that is really interesting about emergence. And I don't know, I think language might be like, especially I think when you have language that's being used actively. Okay, emergent abilities and LLMs. Like you're assembling new words and assembling new meanings. Those things can't necessarily be reverse engineered. We can understand why they happen, but it's hard to see the process in play. So this emergent abilities and LLMs. This is an archive paper.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was the paper you were referencing.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that comes back to the guy who thought the AI was sentient. I mean, in a lot of the conversations I've been having with people about that, it's like, yeah, sure. I mean, could sentience emerge from a language model? Probably.
Yeah.
I don't think sentience is an emergent property. Well, maybe it could be, but
yeah, I know. It's like, how do you define sentience and all that? It goes down the rabbit hole. Yeah, I mean, okay, let me share my screen. We'll talk about this a little bit too, because I'm interested to know. So this is I don't know any of these people, but yeah, I mean, this emergent abilities of large language models. Let me zoom in on it so we can see. So the abstract reads, scaling up language models has been shown to predictively improve performance and sample efficiency on a wide range of downstream tasks. This paper instead discusses an unpredictable phenomena we refer to as emergent abilities of large language models. We consider an ability to be emergent if it is not present in smaller models, but is present in larger models. So that's interesting. That's where you have like larger, we talk about like scale in AI, making the model bigger improves performance. But it also seems to do something else, which is it allows for emergence. And so smaller toy models maybe don't allow for emergence, but larger models may also do that. And it may be because you have more degrees of freedom, more interactions going on that allow for this. Thus, emergent abilities cannot be predicted simply by extrapolating the performance of smaller models. So you can't do this sort of linear scaling. You have to just consider them as separate types of models. The existence of such emergence implies that additional scaling could further expand the range of capabilities of language models. So this means moving in size, but they're different types of things. So this paper is about the unpredictable phenomena of emergent abilities of large language models. And they talk about emergence in very general terms, so this is like kind of going over some of these things. We will consider the following definition of emergence. So this is from Steinhardt 2022 and rooted in a 1972 essay of More is Different by Philip Anderson. And that is, emergence is when quantitative changes in a system result in qualitative changes in behavior. So this is a little bit different example of emergence that I was talking about, maybe, well, from ant colonies, but maybe not, because in the case of ant colonies, the ants are interacting in terms of quantitative. You can measure the quantitative interactions of ants, their behaviors, but then they're generating the structure that we're evaluating qualitatively, saying, is this something that's emergent? And so that's one of the things that... So Liu will explore emergence with respect to model scale, as measured by training compute and number of model parameters. Specifically, we define emergent abilities of large language models as the abilities that are not present in smaller scale models, but are present in large scale models. Thus, they cannot be predicted by simply extrapolating performance on a smaller scale model. So it's like scaling, but it's discontinuous. It's like you have these smaller scale models that behave in one regime, and large scale models that maybe scale by their relative size in another regime. But you have to get to this large scale to get these emergent properties. So you can't just extrapolate from a smaller model. We survey emergent abilities observed in a range of prior work, categorizing them in settings such as few-shot prompting and augmented prompting strategies. Emergence motivates future research on scaling and further emergent abilities. So emergent abilities they define as an ability is emergent if it is not present in smaller models, but it is present in larger models, which is, I guess, is sort of based on their finding. Emergent abilities would not have been directly predicted by extrapolating a scaling law, which means it has to be this linear line, where you have consistent performance improvements from a toy model with very, very few parameters to these very large models with billions of parameters. Like I said, this is a discontinuous scale, I guess. This qualitative change is also known as a phase transition. So I think we've talked about phase transitions where you have this change in behavior, this dramatic change, a shift that differentiates it from other, like the other mode of behavior. So, so this is few-shot prompted tasks. You give it some input, a review, a sentiment. So this movie sucks, that's a negative sentiment. I love this movie, it's a positive sentiment. Then you have the language model, and the output is positive. Because the language model says so, I guess. I don't know. But this is few-shot prompting, and then they show... Okay, so this is where I think this is something that Morgan was talking about in our meeting yesterday. So these are 8 examples of emergence in the few-shot prompting setting. Each point is a separate model. So these are 8 different models here. Truthful question answer, grounded mappings, word in context, figure of speech, word unscramble, modular arithmetic. So these are all different cases, and they're using few-shot prompting. Each point is a separate model. The ability to perform a task via few-shot prompting is emergent when a language model achieves random performance until a certain scale, after which performance significantly increases to well above random. So you see here an example of word unscramble. You have sort of at random behavior with this red dotted line, and this is the blue function. So it's behaving at random, and then all of a sudden it shoots up above. So the exact match is 0%, 0 to 5% for a long time. And this is in training flops, so this is the model scale. So this is where it's like, a smaller model is down here, and a larger model is up here. And so this is actually, when they say smaller model, they mean not smaller, but smaller than the one that exhibits these gains in performance. So so basically, as you increase the model scale, you get these performance improvements. So this isn't running it in time, this is increasing the size of the model. And so you get, in word unscramble, you reach it 10 to the 22nd, you reach this where it goes up. And you can see with truthful Q&A at 10 to the 22nd, it also goes up. This green line goes up quite a bit from this red dotted line. Word in context, it's a little bit larger model that is required to see this emergence, almost 10 to the 24th, and it goes up. You can see this transition in all these cases. You see where the model is around 10 to the 22nd training flops, where you can see this improvement. So this is what they mean by emergence. It emerges above chance accuracy, but it does it all of a sudden as you increase the scaling of the model. So this is what they mean by emergence here. I guess it's the same thing here. You math word problems, instruction following. This is where you have, this almost looks kind of like it's a little bit more linear, but not really, because you have, you have performance improvements here, but a different scale of performance improvement at around 10 to the 22nd. So again, you have these sort of phase transitions that you can see. And so they give a sort of a list of analysis here, sort of, I guess this is what you see in the literature from these different benchmarks. And so these different benchmarks, they train them all, and they want to see where the emergence scale is. So they have this table in here. And then I think that's, why would you see emergence? So although there are dozens of examples of emergent abilities, there are currently few compelling explanations for why such abilities emerge in the way they do. For certain tasks, it may be a natural intuition for why emergence requires a model larger than a particular threshold scale. If multi-step reasoning requires L steps of sequential computation, this might require a model with a depth of at least this many layers. It is also reasonable to assume that more parameters and more training enable better memorization. That could be helpful for tasks acquiring world knowledge, which is this knowledge of the world. A good performance on closed book question answering may require a model with enough parameters to capture the compressed knowledge base itself. So that's one reason maybe why you see emergence at different scales. Then, there are other things like evaluation metrics. There's cross-entropy loss. There are different, explanations they give here. But I think it's a really interesting paper at the core. It's basically arguing that there's this scale at which you see this transition to something that's really performing well. And it's just, it's something I don't think people are really thinking about too much.
Yeah, or maybe, and this is something that I've started noticing. Have you noticed that Jan LeCun has started putting out all these articles that kind of are reversing or trying to reverse this position on this kind of phenomena? Here, and I'll share my screen.
Yeah.
One of these in the Slack the other day. What I think is really interesting about these is that he's kind of talking about, he's responding to Gary Marcus in a lot of really direct, interesting ways, and basically kind of saying, you're right, but you're all wrong. And then, so it's this article came out recently in Neuro magazine, and there was another one on Twitter that was a bit more specific about what Jan LeCun is now thinking the direction for AI to go in is going to be, which sounded to me when I read it was more like a world building direction. But yeah, this paragraph I think applies directly to this. You can't build human-like intelligence just by scaling up. However, you can, of course, build really nice models by scaling up. And so there's all these, there's also a question of whether hybrid systems will help with the ethical problems surrounding AI. No. This is a great article. It's been a lot of fun to read. I don't really have much more to say about it right now because I just wanted to bring that up. This article made me think of it because, this paper. Because this paper's from 2021 in September, and it's just
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, Jan LeCun is maybe backtracking a little bit, but I think it's like more about like thinking about some of these issues more deeply and saying, oh yeah, we have some things to solve. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting issue. Like, when did these models, how do they change as you scale them up or scale them down? And this has been a thing in computer science, like just with respect to performance, like the runtime or the computational complexity. What is that? How does that change when you change the scale of the model? If you're adding things to the problem. So we think of it in terms of combinatorial problems. When you have a lot of things to solve versus very few, that changes the performance of an algorithm. But in this case, you're trying to figure out on data, like how does it learn, and it's an interesting avenue. So Jesse or Samantha, do you have anything you want to add to that, or? Okay. Well, yeah, we can talk more about this in Slack. I guess I'll finish up here today with a presentation I've been meaning to give for a very long time, and it's something I gave at a University of North Carolina, Charlotte, several years ago. And it actually has to do with OpenWorm, but it's interesting because it's about like sort of coding education, open source education, and getting people involved in sort of object-oriented programming from sort of an open worm perspective. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit here. So let me pull up my slides on this. So this is I call this object-oriented modeling for biological systems. Let me do the slideshow. Okay. So this is, kind of thinking about a problem from an object-oriented programming perspective, but using biological systems and OpenWorm as an example of how to do this and how to work through these problems. So it's a little bit of like programming education, computer science education. It's a little bit of like sort of getting people involved in an open source project, and then a little bit about people thinking about biological problems and how to model them. So there's this, before we start, I wanted to point this Quora thread out to people. Is object-oriented programming dead? And so a lot of people have used object-oriented programming to build things, but the question is it worthwhile to learn how to do this? Because it's actually a pretty hard thing to learn sometimes. So they ask this question in a Quora thread, which are usually pretty provocative, maybe unnecessarily so. But so one answer was reports of the death of object-oriented have been greatly exaggerated. It's not the only game in town as it once was. This is due to a number of alternative approaches driven in part by cloud-native deployment concerns, language fashions, and I feel a lack of learning about what object-oriented programming really is. At heart, it is the same creating custom ICs and electronics, and something that is equally useful. OO is still a powerful way to model problems in software. And then the other response I have here is, no, and I can't imagine why anyone would think it was. OOP is the dominant paradigm in programming across most domains, from websites front and back, to games, to desktop software, to mobile apps, to most other things. So, their object-oriented programming is pretty broadly applicable, but a lot of times in like the domain of modeling, we don't really think about it too much, or we don't think about why we would use it and how we would use it creatively. It's maybe a better way to frame this talk. So what is biological? I start with what is biological data. So I kind of move away from the programming part, and I want to introduce what biological data is first. And this is true of any type of data, by the way. This isn't just biological data, but so what do you think about when I say biological data? So this is, in the frame of bioinformatics, this is interesting because in bioinformatics, a lot of people think that that's all like learning about gene sequences or sometimes protein folding, and that's about it. But actually, bioinformatics is much richer than that. And there are a lot of different sources of data. But biological data more generally is very diverse. And so people, are sort of fixated on genetic data, but there's a lot of data that's biological that is very broad, a lot of phenotypic data, a lot of behavioral data, a lot of data like hormones, hormone concentrations, things that we can measure and interpret using different methods and techniques. Now, the second question is, what do you think of when I say that biology is hierarchical? So a lot of times people argue that biology is hierarchical. And there's this model of biology that's what they call the vertical model. So it's from genes to proteins to tissues to organisms to collectives of organisms. That's what they mean by biology is hierarchical. It has that sort of, vertical, not horizontal. This vertical quality where you go from the smallest level to the largest level of organization. And that's somewhat reductionist, but it's also important to think about when you're thinking about modeling, especially object-oriented modeling, because it gives you this natural framework for understanding your data. Now, I said that biology is vertically organized. So what do you think of when I say biology is vertically organized? And of course, I just told you the answer. But, a lot of people won't know that starting out. They won't know about the vertical organization aspect of biology. It's assumed when you learn biology, you kind of go through this, these different levels of organization. But, to think about that more broadly, why is that important? Why is it that biology is vertically organized, and why is that important? It's important because you're taking things and you're putting them together. So, genes, every cell has a genome, its own copy of the genome. And that genome is expressed, and that cell can change over the life of the organism. It can divide, it can differentiate, and then those cells make up tissues. Actually, the genes make proteins. The proteins then can make different types of materials. Those materials then either can be made inside the cell or outside the cell. Then those materials plus the cells, they make tissues. Those tissues then make, different structures. So, like, you can assemble muscle, you can assemble muscle fibers. Those muscle fibers then insert themselves into around bone, around other types of tissues, and they live in this sort of organizational codependence. And then those tissues and those structures become part of an organism. And then those organisms live in a world where they interact with other organisms, or they reproduce and produce other more copies of itself, or other things like that. And so there are all sorts of ways which this vertical organization is really interesting. It's emergent. It exhibits emergence. It exhibits a sort of nested property where, there are things that cascade, information that cascades upward, and sometimes downward, but not, we have to talk about that a little bit more. But that vertical organization is very important. And so it's very important to think about that more broadly than just kind of an introductory figure in a textbook. And then what do you think of when I say that biology is computational? So now, this gets into bioinformatics. This gets into, people talk about the potential of computation for understanding biology. And then they show you a picture of aligning gene sequences. But biology is actually, there's much more potential for simulating biology in computers. And of course, we talk about this in the meeting a lot. Simulating agents and simulating. But this is something that, are computational agents biological? Sort of, in the sense that it's mimicking what we see in biology. But biology is computational also suggests that biological systems have computation. And so A lot of times people argue that the genome is filled with information, and that when there's information processing in say a nervous system, that there's a computational nature to that, that there are computational rules that cells and organisms follow, and there are a lot of ways in which these things intersect. So it's not just modeling an organism; it's actually the organism has computational properties, and that's maybe a little controversial, but you got to think about it both ways. So this is again, biological data is essentially a cornucopia of different things. They're heterogeneous data sources and structures. And I think the important point here is that they're heterogeneous data structures. So not only do you have different sources, so you have all sorts of different things, and they're organized in this vertical hierarchy, but you have all sorts of data structures that one can use to analyze and understand biology. So the first one is this physiological hierarchy, and this is tied to this sort of vertical organization of life. So you can go from molecular networks to cellular networks to organ and tissue networks. And you can actually take data and model each one of these independently as independent layers. So you can say I can model a molecular network and then it tells me something. And I can model a cellular network and it tells me something. And I can model organ and tissue networks and they tell me something else. But then I want to be able to integrate them and say that, like, what happens in the organ and tissue networks affects what happens in the cellular networks. So this is a different type of representation. You have these network representations, and then you have these interlayer representations that kind of interact with one another. And so that's a physiological hierarchy, and this is a paper that lays out this vision for this. There are also things like gene trees. And so gene trees are where you have a gene that you can trace its line of descent. So, you can trace through a line of descent from one species to a number of different species, or one, organism to a number of different lineages. So, like, if you have some founder ancestor and they establish different family lines, that gene that you're tracking will evolve differently or change maybe its frequency, or maybe even its, how many mutations it incurs in these different family lines. And so that may be interesting in inferring things about disease and other things. Or if this is a species tree, where you have genes that split off, in different species the gene might change function. And so it's important to know, to be able to trace that out. And so you can use gene trees, which are tree structures. They're, directed trees and directed graphs. So this paper talks a little bit about gene trees as a representation. And then these retinal progenitor cell lineages. So these are cell lineages where the cell differentiates and divides. So in this case, you have these precursor cells at the top. And over the course of development, they differentiate into these different cell types that make up the retina. So there are a lot of different cell types in the retina, and you need to have this account of how they differentiate and at what time they differentiate. And so this is a paper in development that talks about this model. So this again is a directed graph. So that's the different types of representation you can use. There are also many potential data sources at all scales. So we can go to what they call transcriptomics, which are different types of, you can collect data from microarrays, RNA-seq, reverse transcription, PCR. You can collect genetic variation from SNP arrays, aligning genome sequences. You have cellular information that you can uncover using microscopy, different types of machine learning to get features out of those microscopy images. You have phenotypic information, which is different types of measurements of development, biometrics, and then functional activity, such as neuroimaging and motion tracking. And so there are public databases for all these types of data. This is an image of big data. This is kind of how people envision it. I don't know. But this is, what I'm saying to you is that if you want to analyze these different, vertical layers of biology, There are all sorts of data sources that are publicly available that you can use to build models and put these things together. So one of the things we want to do is we want to turn biological systems into computation. So this is the C. elegans worm. This is like the basis for OpenWorm. And this worm can be broken down in a number of ways. So we can actually, if we want to model this organism, and this is an idealized form of the organism, but if we just want to model this phenotype, we can use a number of ways to do. There are a number of ways to do this. We can use numeric matrices, so you can turn some of these features into numbers and build a matrix of the numbers, or of the features, and turn them into numbers, binary numbers, continuous number scales. There's literature mining, which is text, so there are papers on different things in the worm, so there are different anatomical structures for which there are whole sets of papers on. There is literature on, physiology and behavior and the development of the worm. So we want to mine that text and understand what the literature has been on, what people have found interesting, what the findings have been for certain things. We have gene sequences in each cell, and so we have these gene sequences we can align and put into a matrix. We have these classification trees which allow us to classify anything in the organism, from cells to organs to genes to other things in the organism, behaviors, and we classify them in a tree. We can use biological and statistical laws to classify things. So we have these linear scaling laws. We have other types of statistical laws that can describe things in the organism. We have networks, so we can put these, literature reviews or these sequences into networks to see how they interact. We have databases where, we can store these matrices and share them with other people. We can draw from different databases on different things. And then we have ontologies, which are taking databases and labeling the data. So ontologies are usually ways that you can specify descriptions of this organism with words, but the words actually have it's like a universal classification system. Instead of just everyone throwing out their own word, you can organize those descriptions in ways that are, systematic, but also, lead you to different subsystems. So, we might classify different cells in C. elegans, and they actually have names. You can classify them developmentally, you can classify them functionally, and those ontologies then can describe what the function of the cell is, what, where it's found. There are a lot of pieces of description that you can use with ontologies. So this is how you turn an organism into some computational structure. So what are the advantages of an object-oriented representation specifically? And this is where I get into object-oriented representations. So this is where we have these different classes and behaviors of things, but it's a computational description. And it isn't necessarily mapped to the biology, it's just how the program behaves. But now we're going to take the biology and move it into that space. So what are the advantages of object-oriented representations here? The first is that it enables computation in a biological feature space. So we have these biological feature spaces. We have data that we're extracting from the organism, and we're computing on that. The second is that it creates relational programs. So, we want to be able to relate these parts of the organism together. And so we can do that with an object-oriented representation. We can build both realistic and abstract models. So we can build like a realistic model of C. elegans, a very accurate model, but we can also build a more abstract model where we want to maybe ask questions about maybe what the effects of mutations are, or what would happen if you took out different cells, or if things were different and it evolved in a different way. We can ask questions like that. And then finally, we can assemble data into hierarchical representations where we have one thing that is under a bunch of things that are underneath one thing. And so you can use this in a programming sense to capture some of, it almost describes sort of the relations, again, between things in the organism. So then this is my plug for OpenWorm, where I invite people into this space, describe what OpenORM is. It's where we took the C. elegans, which is an organism that has the same number of cells in every individual. It's somewhere around 1,000 cells. There are 302 cells in the nervous system, and every one of these cells is pretty well described. So it's a good candidate for this type of modeling. So you have things like muscles, neurons, projection between the neurons, and we can build a computational model of all of this. And then we can also build things into the model where we not only describe things like the cells, but we describe the cell function, and we can integrate data into that. So we can have the data on like the cell position, where it is in the phenotype, but we can also describe it in terms of the function in data that describe that function. So, this is an example of object-oriented representation. We have classes, and so the classes are different than our typical classes in a program. In this case, we have embryo, connectome, heredity, and genome, and those are classes that we've defined from the biology. Then we have object instances, or objects that are instances of these classes. So these are like cell ID, cell gene network, cell lineage. And then we have attributes, which are attributes of the objects, which are instances of classes, which is where you have specific names of cells, cell-cell connections, cell-cell interactions, mother-daughter pairs. So when cells divide, the mother divides into two daughters. You can map those pairs together. Or gene sequence motifs, where you find different patterns in the gene sequence. And then finally, methods of the attributes of the objects that are instances of the classes. And those represent spatial relationships, cellular differentiation, and sequence comparisons. So this is the embryo space. This is a class, or an example of a class, which is embryo space. So this is where we've taken a bunch of, as a point cloud of different cell centroids, and an embryo space. This is about 300 embryos, looking at the positions of cells in that embryo. And it forms what looks like maybe like a point cloud that looks like an embryo on 3 different anatomical dimensions. So this is a class that we can operate from. We can apply this sort of hierarchy, object hierarchy, into the biological world. So our embryo space is a class, and then we can break it down from there. We also could, alternatively, consider heredity as a class. So each of these cells, most of these cells have some sort of heredity. So, if you take like the first cell in the embryo, the P0 cell, it has a deep heredity because it's dividing and providing heritable information to all these cells underneath it. Each one of these cells generally will have some daughter cell or some heredity in it. So this is something we can treat the embryo space as a class, or we can treat heredity as a class. And these are 2 different ways of looking at development. And so the object, though, is the same. It's a developmental cell. So you have a developmental cell here and here in this tree. And you can treat it in either way, but you really are dealing with 2 sides of the same coin. And then the attributes are daughter pairs. So these are daughter pairs. This is like this is the way this is set up. And then you can find the method of spatial relations. So this is the AP axis. This is the AP axis here. You can map from one to the other. So you have 2 different ways to represent the system. You can map between this in different ways, and it gives you two ways to represent the same system. So a schema for a particular biological phenomena. If we look at class, we have a number of different candidates. We can use cells, nerves, tissues, movements, and organs. If we want to look at objects, we have a number of varieties that we can draw from, like neuronal cells, locomotion, muscle, germ cells, and pharynx. And then in an object, how do you generate varieties of a specific biological phenomena? So this is a method. This is a procedure associated with an object. You have this object which contains data. It has a property. So this is the developmental cell object. And each one of these developmental cells as an individual object contains data, and that's the property of that object. And so we can now go from like these things to attaching data to those things. And so now we have a developmental cell with data properties. We can then have it do different things. So its method then is to divide, to apoptose, which means to die a program death. It will die after a certain number of divisions or die after a certain amount of time. Or it'll differentiate to a new type. And so that would be a new object. And so methods determine behaviors. Object at time, the specific time that you're looking. So there are different methods for this object. And then when we go to the behavior of each method, we have things like mitosis. So division actually has a behavior, and that behavior is mitosis. And the behavior determines what objects do. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to map these computational concepts of object-oriented programming to the biological system and its how its function. So again, object state is what objects have. So objects have methods, and the object state has different methods. So the object behavior is what objects do. And so in this case, we have methods that are different from this case. So this is genealogy, expression network, and genome. In terms of object behavior, we have different methods altogether. So we have methods that call for state objects, or methods that call for behavior. And so in this case, we have divide, apoptose, and differentiate. And then finally, object identity, what makes objects unique. And yet we have yet again more methods, different methods, that describe the identity. So each developmental cell as an object will have a 3D location, mutation, and cell ID. And those are, again, methods that we can call in our program. So I've gone through class and object, and then instance. So an instance is how these varieties occur in nature. And so these are just kind of like cell types, different behaviors. Omega turns striated muscle as a type of tissue, and the grinder function is something that is a behavior as well. So this is an example of an instance. These are body movements. OpenWorm actually has a database of movements in C. elegans, and so these are well classified. These are very stereotypical movements that you observe in C. elegans. It's another reason why you would use C. elegans for this. There's a citation on this from 2005. So if you're looking at body movements, the object locomotion, say we have an object that's locomotion, it includes all of these instances. So these are different types of movements of this organism. So object locomotion includes whale-type turns, omega-type turns, moving backwards and forwards, and being at rest. Any mode that you can think of. So those are instances of the object locomotion. Distinct modes of movement behavior occur as a consequence of various behaviors, environments, and physiological states. So you have an object with a series of instances. Those instances will change based on the object and its properties. So we have, we can describe this whole thing as a hierarchy of these different objects, and, eventually we end up with these instances in which the thing can exist. And so, eigenworms are an example of how we can extract these major features from a range of movements. And I might add that in object-oriented programming, we kind of operate from this position of we want to really characterize the system well. Because if we only have as many instances as we have observations of instances. If there are different movements that we haven't characterized, those instances won't be in the program, and the program can't replicate those things. So eigenworms are one way to extract these different types of instances, these different behaviors. Even if they don't seem very relevant, they might actually play a role in the simulation. And so this is from PLOS Computational Biology in 2008. It talks about the Eigenworm method. And so this is an important part of modeling biology, is to get the phenomenology right, to get what's going on, all the possible states correct. So there are higher level concepts such as inheritance, encapsulation, abstraction, and polymorphism. And again, these fit in, polymorphism not being different forms of the phenotype, but being like a computational tool. So object-oriented inheritance is where new classes can perceive properties of existing classes Cell class becomes multiple types, so you have these different types of cell. All the basic properties of cell, and extend class with new methods such as potential. So you can extend the class with different methods. So this is a way of incorporating new information or variable information over the course of the lifetime of the organism. So you have these inheritance trees that you can build. This is not a lineage tree, but it's similar to it in that it allows you to build, what things get inherited. So you have a nematode, a cell, a pluripotent cell, an excitable cell, a germ cell, a developmental cell. These different types of cells that you divide into, say, like a developmental type of cell and a neuronal type of cell. So you're differentiating between cell types, and then you're giving different types of subsets of those, and this is all an you can set this up as an inheritance. So a cell or a pluripotent cell inherits the cell, and it goes down like that. It's just a way to structure the program. Object-oriented encapsulation. These are objects that hide the internal complexity of an underlying process. So you're building a wrapper, say, for worm reproduction. It would look something like this. You reproduce, you fertilize, you lay eggs, you hatch. This is enough information, theoretically, to reproduce and assess fitness. So this is one way we can do this without saying, like, we're going to assess fitness from the top down. We're going to try to build a program to do this from the actual biology and simulating the system. Then we have object-oriented abstraction, which is generalized components of the system that does not need to be specified. So this is where we can abstract a model of the organism from genes to behavior, or a simple physical model of behavior, and we can use different algorithms to sort of figure those things out. Object-oriented polymorphism are objects and can be replaced by different forms of that object. So you can have a single object with multiple types of behavior. So, for example, mutations at different locations in a gene have different effects on the phenotype. So in C. elegans, you have these defined mutations that lead to different phenotypes. So in this case, a polymorphism in programming would encapsulate that biological difference. So how do object-oriented representations put biological data into context? So this is a challenge where you have embryogenesis in a computational world. So this is from Gray's Anatomy, and this shows an embryo and its different stages. And then on the right, you have this model of a cellular automata, which is this grid world type model with cells. And the agents are changing, and they can build these, like they can engage in this sort of morphogenesis where they generate, different forms, and then you can actually model these forms in different ways. So this is from the Trends in Biotechnology in 2018, where they talk about this. They use different, things that you would find in morphogenesis to build these shapes, and then you can model the shapes in different ways and describe them. So one thing we want to do, though, in biological modeling is avoid what they call spherical cows. And a spherical cow is where you oversimplify a system. And it goes back to the old physics joke about, like, if you ask a physicist to model something, they'll say, assume a spherical cow. Or if you ask them to model a cow. So that's not particularly useful to model a spherical cow, because they're just using physical principles to model it to start off with. So that's not really what we want. We want to have a good accounting of it. So this sort of spherical cow phenomena happens when we have too high a level of abstraction. When we take the problem, we really generate like a model that isn't grounded in the real world. So things like body, head, tail, and skin classes are an insufficient description of a cow, or for a worm for that matter. Simplified phenotypes have no cellular classes, no genomic classes. And when you have a too simple of an abstraction, a too high level of abstraction, you end up with these spherical cows. And that's what we want to avoid. In the world of cows, we have this spherical cow, which is where we have too little specification. We can have a bit more specification and end up with this plastic cow, and then a real cow where we really add in a lot of specification. But we also run the risk of not knowing all of the different states that exist. So this is where we extract features from data, we build these abstractions and representations, and then we need system context. And we put those together, we have something that approximates a real biological system. And so we have these embryos that occur over developmental time. They have different properties. And then how do you represent time-dependent processes? How do you represent all these different transformations in time? And so that's one of the things we're trying to capture as well. How do we build extensible representations incorporating future knowledge? What features can be encapsulated? And what is the appropriate level of abstraction? And so those are all the things, just from this simple time series of embryos. These are the things that we need to consider. And then we can also develop category theoretic models. So this is a category theoretic model of development, and this is in this paper that we published through Evolutionary. And this is where you have different cell types, and you have these categories, and then you have these functors that transform the properties of these cells from one cell type to another. So you can do things like this that are a little bit outside of the realm of object-oriented modeling, but are related to it. So let's build a computational embryo. This was my sales pitch for this and for the Evolutionary project, but Openworm more specifically. So that was I wanted to give that talk, and I see that who's here aside from Samantha and okay. One more thing I wanted to talk about though is this idea of composition over inheritance. So we talked about composition earlier with respect to language models, and we've talked about inheritance in this case. There's this idea that composition over inheritance, or composite reuse principle in object-oriented programming, is the principle that classes should achieve polymorphic behavior and encode reuse by their composition, by containing instances of other classes and implement their desired functionality, rather than inheritance from a base or parent class. So this is something that, when you think about these programming models, sometimes there are different ways to deal with this. And I just thought that, thinking about not just inheritance but composition is, really kind of an interesting direction for this. And so it just shows that you can, combine these different types of models and how they work. And I don't know what the implications of this are for AI, but I think it's, maybe kind of interesting. Oh, hello, Rashik. How are you?
Hi. Yeah, it was a really nice talk. I just wanted to, sorry if I'm interrupting, but I just want to do a little introduction, if that's okay.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, so I'm a software engineer working at a biotech company, and I was talking to Morgan Huff from the NeuroTechX, and he recommended me this meeting. So I'm interested in working on human and AI symbiosis. So I just wanted to know which subfield of it would be a good way to make contributions, and so I thought I joined this meetup because I wanted to see if I can learn anything. So
yeah. Well, yeah, maybe we could talk more about this in the Slack. I'm not really sure what your it depends on what your interests are, and we're not really doing we do have open source software to contribute to, but we also have other things that are going on. So maybe we could talk in the Slack, DM or something. That would be good.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. Do we have anything else for the meeting? We're about to wrap up here. I don't know if Jesse had anything to say, or Brian, or Samantha.
The only thing I wanted to say was that this has been a great meeting. I get to hang out with Bradley for 2 hours and ask him a stupid questions. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, no problem. Yeah. All right. Well, all right. I'm going to see Jesse tomorrow, and then the rest of you next week. So have a good week.